Okay, our next speaker comes to us from FAST. This is Niki Armstrong. She's the Vice President of Genetic Services and Education at FAST, and she's going to talk to us about clinical trials, participant rights, and responsibilities. Niki Armstrong.
Forward, backward, forward, backward. Thank you. So I am talking today. I'm a genetic counselor by training, but actually my discussion today is not going to include even the word genes, so that's a little bit weird for me. But instead, I'm going to be talking about clinical trials and participant rights and responsibilities. And that's another one of my interests. I actually spent about 8 years as a genetic counselor working in the clinical trial space at a major hospital university. And so I'm really passionate about families understanding participant rights and responsibilities in clinical trials. This is a really important time for this talk for Angelman syndrome, because we're about to start much larger clinical trials. There's a lot more clinical trials that are going to be in the space. So that's going to need more participants. More families are going to have the opportunity to participate in clinical trials. So we want to make sure that families are educated as they're considering those. So first off, as a genetic counselor, I like to start with a good definition of everything. So it's important to understand that a clinical trial is a very specific kind of research study. It's essentially an experiment. It's a carefully designed research study to test something. It's usually either an intervention, a drug, or device. In Angelman syndrome, it's primarily been drugs, so I'm going to use the word drug a lot. And the goal is to test that particular thing in a group of individuals using a very structured process. And that structured process includes an outcome at the end. So we heard a lot about endpoints and outcome measures. We always have something we're going to measure at the end to try to see if that new drug is effective and provides benefit. During the clinical trial, there's a really structured process. We call that the protocol. That's the plan that everyone within the clinical trial needs to follow. And the point of that, really, clinical trials, you have two goals. One, you want to ensure that everyone who participates in the clinical trial is safe. And two, you're trying to make sure that whether or not this drug is effective. To participate in a clinical trial, that is always voluntary. Families choose whether or not they want to participate. So if you're thinking about participating in a clinical trial, as the caregiver of a potential participant, you have a lot of rights and responsibilities to help keep you informed and keep your loved ones safe. Clinical trials in Angelman syndrome, there's a lot of similarities with clinical trials in other diseases, both rare diseases and common diseases like cancer. So the National Institutes of Health and the Food and Drug Administration actually put together a lot of tools about what these rights and responsibilities ought to be. So a lot of the material in these slides was actually taken from those websites. First off, and probably the most important, especially as we think of ethically, is the right to be informed, or the right for informed consent. So informed consent is typically defined as the process where a healthcare provider educates the participant or the guardian about everything that happens during the clinical trial. It's a process, so it typically happens at the very beginning of a clinical trial before any of the things that happen during the clinical trial start. And it usually involves a form that both parties sign at the end, so it's kind of like an agreement between the family and the research center. And included in that informed consent is the study purpose. What is this clinical trial studying? And what are the outcomes? What are the things we're going to measure at the end? It includes the procedures. So what's going to happen during the clinical trial? Things like, are there blood tests? Is there going to be a lumbar puncture? Are there EEGs? Are there an MRI? All of that will be laid out in the informed consent. If there are alternatives, so if something else has already been approved, that has to be spelled out in the informed consent. And then probably the most important thing, the one that families have the most questions about, are what are the risks and benefits of participating in this clinical trial? So what do we know so far about this potential therapy for risks and benefits? Along those same lines of informed consent is the right to learn if any new information becomes available. Each clinical trial is different, but many clinical trials last a long period of time. They might last 2 years, 3 years, even longer than that. And so during that time span, new information becomes available. And as a participant in a clinical trial, you have the right to know if there are any new risks identified, or if there are any changes in risk level, like if the risk level is higher than they thought, or maybe there's a new intervention that makes the risk level lower. And then you also have the right to know the final results from that clinical trial. But it's important to understand that that doesn't happen while you're in the clinical trial. That happens after the clinical trial is over, after all the data has been processed. If you choose to participate in a clinical trial, you have the right to stop participating at any time. So again, participation is voluntary. If you can choose to stop participating because there was a side effect. You can choose to stop participating because there was a change in your life, like a new job, or you moved further away from a trial center. You can also choose to stop participating because it's not good for your life anymore. And there are no penalties, so no monetary penalties or anything like that. And you can continue to receive your clinical care. So if you had a neurologist before that followed for seizures, you would continue to follow with your neurologist from before the clinical trial. You have the right to privacy and confidentiality. So this is like any other medical records. Your data is protected and kept safe. Only the individuals who need access to that information have access to it. And if the data needs to be shared with anyone, like a regulatory body like the Food and Drug Administration, or published in a journal, your identifiable information is removed. So things like names and date of birth and all of that get removed. During the clinical trial, you have the right to monitoring and treatment. So clinical trials typically include regular health checkups. Sometimes those are in-person visits where they do a physical exam and they might do some blood tests to check kidney and liver function. Sometimes that might be something like phone calls or virtual visits to ask how the participant is feeling, if they've noticed any changes, but there are always regular health monitoring throughout the trial. If there are any side effects that occur during a clinical trial, you have the rights to prompt treatment for whatever that side effect is, and any long-term follow-up care that needs to happen as a result of that side effect. Now, flipping over to thinking about responsibilities. So the point of the clinical trial is to try to figure out whether a new drug is effective. And so in order to do that, we have to keep everything as consistent as possible throughout the clinical trial. That means that we need everyone to do essentially the exact same thing. That's why they develop these plans, these protocols that everyone in the clinical trial should follow. So families participating in the clinical trial need to really follow those protocols. They need to follow the instructions that they're given as best as they possibly can. And they need to make the commitment to try to make it to all of the visits that they committed to make. They also have to be really honest about any changes that they identify, anything new that comes up with their loved one, because all of that information needs to be gathered as part of the clinical trial. If you're thinking about a clinical trial for your loved one, you really have a responsibility to ask questions. You need to understand what's happening in that clinical trial. If anything is unclear, ask more. You need to really feel comfortable with your decision, that your decision is informed. Participating in clinical trials is not for every family, and that is okay. It's a really big commitment. There are risks associated with every single clinical trial, so you have to really think about and weigh the potential benefits and the potential risks and understand those pieces before you commit to a clinical trial. And once you're in the clinical trial, recognize that you have a responsibility to keep asking questions. So as time goes by, if the clinical trial is 6 months or a year long and you have new questions come up, there are specific people within the clinical trial that you can reach out to ask those ongoing questions. So keep that communication open. One of the really important responsibilities if you're participating in a clinical trial is to report any side effects. Again, one of the things we want to learn from clinical trials is whether or not the potential drug is safe. And so because of that, when you start a clinical trial, before anyone is dosed, they will typically give you an idea of what to do if any side effects are noticed. With certain side effects that are, of course, severe or an emergency, they would give you an emergency contact information for. Other potential side effects, they might ask you to keep a diary, or they might ask you to call, or there will be different kind of levels of how to both keep track of those and when to notify the team. And I think one of the things that in my experience in working with families in clinical trials to really consider as you learn about a particular clinical trial is think about what that clinical trial might look like for your family. Like I said before, clinical trials are not right for every person, and each clinical trial is different. So it might be that one clinical trial fits your family well, but another one doesn't. Some clinical trials are only going to be in a few locations, so participating is going to require a lot of travel. So then you would need to think about, hey, can I get to that study site? Can I take the time off work? Do I have other children? Does someone need to, do I have someone available to watch those other children? How would my loved one with Angelman syndrome, how would they do being in the clinical trial? Does it make them really nervous to go into a hospital setting? Like, how could we handle that? Like, think about all the different pieces, because once you're in the clinical trial, we really want people to be able to continue to be in that clinical trial so that their information can continue to be collected and can then be used to determine whether or not the drug in the trial is safe and effective. So if you're interested in learning more about clinical trials in general, clinicaltrials.gov is a really great resource. We also worked together with the team over at ASF with Amanda Mora and Katie Garbarini to do a Clinical Trials 101 in Angelman Syndrome video, which you can find at that website there, cureangelman.org resources. And if you're looking for clinical trial information specific to Angelman syndrome, always talking to your Angelman syndrome specific healthcare providers is really helpful. Some clinical trials have a website specifically for that clinical trial, so that can be a good source of information. Webinars or conferences like this one. So tomorrow, of course, we're going to hear a lot about some of the upcoming clinical trials. Those are all great resources. And then I want to put a plug in for a new resource through the FAST website. We have a new drug development pipeline, and that the QR code there will take you to it. And essentially what you can see is all of the, really all of the things that we kind of been talking through that are in the drug development pipeline are listed on the left by pillar as they've been presented. And then anything that's over into purple means it's into clinical trials. And so if you can click on each of these items to get more information. And if you click on the ones that are in purple, you can go straight to the clinical trial information. There's also any of the past videos that have been put out about them. If there are press releases or any other additional information that's available, we tried to compile it all in one place so that families can have all the information about particular potential therapies and clinical trials in the same one spot. So we're hoping that you will find that really helpful. And then I'm here if I can help at all. So if you have general questions about clinical trials, you can always email me. And then if you're in the US, I am happy to meet with you one-on-one, and that's a QR code to my one-on-one scheduling. So thanks so much. Thank you.